In a world where pain and silence reigned, man and beast clung to each other, bound by something deeper than words. Ryan never expected his life to intertwine with a creature as fiercely independent as Molly, a rescued bobcat whose golden eyes spoke the silent language of the wilderness. When tragedy struck without warning, it was Molly who sensed it first. The human body is fragile. One moment, strong and unyielding. The next, crumbling under the weight of fate, his mind drowning in a sea of blackness. A brain hemorrhage struck like a lightning bolt, merciless and swift, dragging him to the brink of death. He had given the bobcat a second chance at life, and now, in ways he never imagined, it refused to let him slip away. How far can the thread of connection stretch between two souls, one human, one wild, when darkness threatens to sever it forever? Join us in an emotional journey where love transcends species. Miracles defy explanation, and the wild heart beats in rhythm with our own. Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories.
The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the wooden deck of Ryan Jessen's modest Colorado home. Nestled at the edge of the wilderness, the house was a perfect reflection of its owner, unpretentious yet remarkable in its quiet harmony with the natural world. Ryan, a 33-year-old landscape designer with kind eyes and calloused hands, sat on the deck's edge, watching as Molly, his rescued bobcat, stalked playfully through the tall grass beyond. "Come on, girl," he called softly, patting the weathered boards beside him. "Dinner time." The sleek feline paused, ears twitching forward at the sound of his voice. Unlike most wild bobcats, Molly's movements held no fear of humans, at least not of Ryan. Their story had begun 3 years earlier, when Ryan had found the orphaned kid, barely alive, her mother likely killed by poachers. Though he'd initially planned to surrender her to a wildlife rehabilitation center, the bond between them had formed too quickly. With special permits and training, Ryan had become one of the rare few licensed to keep a bobcat, not as a pet, but as what he called a wild companion. Molly sauntered toward the deck, her spotted coat catching the golden light. She was smaller than most female bobcats, her growth likely stunted by her difficult start in life, but her eyes held the ancient wisdom of her species, wary, intelligent, and fiercely independent. She moved with fluid grace onto the deck and brushed against Ryan's leg, accepting a gentle scratch behind her tufted ears before settling beside him. "Just you and me tonight," Ryan murmured. His sister Michelle was supposed to visit tomorrow, a thought that made him smile despite the persistent headache that had plagued him for days. Michelle and Molly maintained a respectful distance from each other. His sister had never quite gotten comfortable with the idea of a wild predator in her brother's home, and Molly seemed to sense her unease. Ryan rubbed his temples, wincing at the sharp pain that had intensified throughout the day. He'd been pushing himself too hard lately, working long hours on a challenging landscape project for an upscale mountain retreat. Perhaps he was dehydrated or simply exhausted. He'd rest tonight, drink more water, be fine by morning. Rising to his feet, Ryan felt a sudden wave of dizziness. The world tilted strangely, the sunset blurring into streaks of crimson and gold. He reached for the railing to steady himself, but his hand found only air as the deck seemed to rise up to meet him. The last thing he registered was Molly's startled yowl and the strange sensation of falling without moving. Molly paced the length of the house as darkness fell, her movements agitated and purposeful. Something was wrong with her human. He had fallen and now lay too still on the wooden floor of the deck, unresponsive to her tentative nudges and increasingly urgent vocalizations. The bobcat's acute senses detected subtle changes in Ryan's breathing, too shallow, too irregular. The familiar scent that surrounded him had altered, carrying an unfamiliar sharpness that triggered ancient warning signals in her brain. As night deepened, Molly's distress grew. She alternated between lying beside Ryan's motionless form and patrolling the perimeter of the deck, her eyes glowing in the darkness as she scanned the surrounding wilderness. Predators could be drawn to vulnerability, and she would not leave him unprotected. But as hours passed with no improvement, the Bobcat's behavior became increasingly frantic. Near midnight, headlights cut through the darkness as Michelle's car pulled into the gravel driveway a day earlier than expected. She had been unable to sleep, troubled by a persistent feeling that she should check on her brother. Their parents had died in a car accident when Ryan was just 22 and Michelle 18, leaving them with only each other. The siblings had always maintained a close connection, sometimes sensing when the other needed them most. As Michelle stepped from her car, Molly did something unprecedented. Instead of retreating into the shadows as she typically did when visitors arrived, the Bobcat appeared at the edge of the deck, vocalizing loudly. A series of urgent calls unlike anything Michelle had heard before. "Ryan," Michelle called, her voice tight with sudden concern. When no answer came, she approached cautiously, remembering her brother's frequent reminders about giving Molly space. But tonight, the Bobcat showed no signs of territoriality. Instead, she paced back and forth between Michelle and the far corner of the deck, her behavior unmistakably intentional. Following Molly's lead, Michelle rounded the corner to find her brother lying unconscious, his skin ashen in the moonlight. "Ryan," she fell to her knees beside him, fingers fumbling for a pulse as she pulled her phone from her pocket with her free hand. "Oh God, Ryan, please." As Michelle called emergency services, Molly positioned herself at Ryan's head, her body tense and alert. The Bobcat's golden eyes never left his face, and a low, continuous rumble emanated from her chest. Not quite a growl, not quite a purr, but something in between that seemed to say, "Fight, stay, live." The small community hospital in Boulder wasn't equipped for the severity of Ryan's condition. The initial CT scan revealed a massive brain hemorrhage requiring immediate specialized care. Within hours of his arrival, he was airlifted to the University of Colorado Hospital in Denver, leaving Michelle to follow by car, her mind racing with terrifying possibilities. "He's young and otherwise healthy," the emergency physician had told her before the transfer, his expression grave but not without hope. "That works in his favor, but I need to be honest with you. This type of hemorrhage is very serious. We're going to do everything we can." Everything they could, Michelle soon learned, included placing Ryan in a medically induced coma to reduce swelling in his brain, followed by emergency surgery to relieve the pressure. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Elena Vasquez, emerged from the operating room with carefully measured optimism. "We've managed to stop the bleeding and reduce the pressure," she explained, her dark eyes kind but direct. "The next 48 hours will be critical. We won't know the extent of the damage until we begin to bring him out of the coma, which won't be for several days at minimum." "What caused this?" Michelle asked, her voice barely audible in the sterile hallway. "He's only 33. Sometimes these aneurysms are congenital, present from birth, but asymptomatic until they rupture. Other times they develop over years due to factors like high blood pressure or smoking. In many cases, we never identify a definitive cause." Dr. Vasquez placed a gentle hand on Michelle's shoulder. "What matters now is that your quick action got him help in time to give him a fighting chance." Not my quick action, Michelle thought. Molly's. The days that followed blurred together as Michelle split her time between the hospital and Ryan's home, where Molly's behavior had become increasingly concerning. The Bobcat refused to eat, paced constantly, and spent hours staring out the windows in the direction of the city. Though legally allowed to live with Ryan because of his special wildlife permit, Molly couldn't be left alone indefinitely. Yet Michelle knew that taking her to a wildlife sanctuary, even temporarily, would devastate her brother when he recovered. So Michelle stayed, sleeping in Ryan's spare room, maintaining an uneasy coexistence with the grieving Bobcat. She followed the detailed care instructions Ryan had meticulously documented, offering food that remained untouched and respecting the boundaries he had established for Molly's well-being. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. Perhaps it was their shared concern for Ryan, or perhaps it was simple necessity, but the distance between woman and Bobcat gradually diminished. It started when Michelle found herself talking aloud to Molly, sharing updates from the hospital, or simply voicing her fears into the quiet house. "His brain activity is stable," she said one evening, curled on the couch with a barely touched cup of tea. "Dr. Vasquez says that's a good sign, but they're still concerned about the pressure." She glanced up to find Molly watching her from across the room, unblinking. "He's fighting, Molly. He's so strong." The Bobcat's ears twitched forward at the sound of Ryan's name, and for the first time, she approached Michelle voluntarily, settling on the far end of the same couch. It wasn't exactly friendship, but it was acknowledgement, recognition of their shared vigil. By the 6th day, with Ryan still unresponsive in the hospital, Molly's condition had deteriorated to the point that Michelle feared for her health. The Bobcat barely slept, refused all food, and had begun clawing at the door whenever Michelle prepared to leave for the hospital. "I don't know what to do," Michelle confessed to Dr. Vasquez during her daily update call. "She's grieving herself sick, and I'm worried she'll injure herself trying to escape and find him." There was a long pause on the line before the neurosurgeon spoke. "This may sound unconventional, but have you considered bringing her to visit? To the hospital? Is that even allowed?" "Typically, no," Dr. Vasquez admitted. "But we make exceptions for service animals, and while your brother's Bobcat doesn't fall into that category officially, we do know that familiar presences can sometimes reach patients when nothing else can. I'd need to get special approval, and there would be strict conditions, but it might help them both." Michelle closed her eyes, imagining Ryan's face if he knew Molly was being denied comfort in his absence. "Let me look into the legalities with his wildlife permit. If we can make it work safely, I think Ryan would want us to try." 2 days later, after numerous conversations with hospital administrators, wildlife officials, and Ryan's veterinarian, a plan was put in place. Molly would be allowed a brief, controlled visit during a quiet evening hour when the ICU floor was least busy. She would need to be transported in her travel kennel and kept on the special harness Ryan used for their rare public outings. Michelle would be responsible for controlling her at all times, and at the first sign of distress from Molly, Ryan, or any hospital staff, the visit would end immediately. The night of the visit, Michelle was surprised by how calmly Molly entered her travel kennel. It was as if the Bobcat somehow understood the purpose of their journey. The drive to Denver was silent except for the occasional soft sounds from the back of the car, not distressed yowls, but the quiet chirps Molly typically reserved for Ryan alone. At the hospital, they were met by Dr. Vasquez and a nurse named Thomas who, Michelle was relieved to discover, had experience with exotic animals from his previous work at a zoo hospital. "I'll go in first to check his vitals and prepare the space," Thomas explained, his voice gentle as he glanced at the kennel. "We've minimized equipment around the bed as much as possible, and I'll make sure the monitoring alarms are set to silent alert so they won't startle her." Michelle nodded, grateful for their thoughtfulness. She's usually very calm with Ryan. "I'm just not sure how she'll react seeing him like this." Dr. Vasquez studied the Bobcat with professional interest. "Animals often sense things we don't. Just follow our lead. And remember, this is as much for her as it is for him." When they finally entered Ryan's room, Michelle was struck anew by how small her brother looked surrounded by medical equipment. After a week in the coma, his face was gaunt, his normally suntanned skin pale against the white sheets. The only sounds were the rhythmic whoosh of the ventilator and the steady beep of the heart monitor. Michelle set the kennel down near the bed and knelt beside it, speaking softly to Molly. "We're here, girl. Ryan's here." When she opened the kennel door, Molly emerged cautiously, her sensitive nose working overtime as she processed the unfamiliar scents of the hospital room. Her ears flattened slightly at the strange surroundings, but her focus quickly settled on the figure in the bed. She approached slowly, stopping at the bedside, her golden eyes fixed on Ryan's face. Thomas moved to help, carefully lowering the bed rail on one side. "It's okay," he assured Michelle. "Let's see what she wants to do." For a long moment, Molly simply stood still, her tail twitching as she studied Ryan. Then, with surprising gentleness, she leapt onto the bed and navigated around the four lines to settle in the space between Ryan's legs, her favorite resting spot at home. She stretched her body along his side and placed her head lightly against his ribs, her eyes half closing as she tuned in to the rhythm of his breathing. The room fell silent as they watched this reunion, too moved to speak. Minutes passed, and Molly remained perfectly still except for the slight rise and fall of her breathing. Then, something extraordinary happened. Thomas noticed at first a subtle change in the pattern of the heart monitor. His heart rate is increasing slightly, he murmured, moving to check the readout. Nothing concerning, just different. Dr. Vasquez approached the bedside, her experienced eyes scanning both the monitors and her patient. His respiratory rate is changing too. These are the kinds of fluctuations we sometimes see when coma patients perceive something meaningful, a familiar voice, a beloved piece of music, or the presence of a beloved companion, Michelle thought, watching as Molly began to emit a sound she'd never heard before. Not quite the purr of a domestic cat, but a deeper, more resonant vibration that seemed to travel through her entire body and into Ryan's. "That's fascinating," Thomas whispered. "Bobcats don't actually purr like house cats. Their throat structures are different, but she's creating a similar vibration." As if in response to this observation, Ryan's fingers on his right hand twitched. A small movement, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to those watching closely. Michelle gasped, reaching for her brother's hand. "Ryan, can you hear me?" Dr. Vasquez moved quickly to the bedside, extracting her penlight to check his pupillary response. This could be reflex movement, but combined with the changes in his vitals. She kept her voice measured, professional, though her eyes held a new spark of interest. "Ryan, if you can hear my voice, try to squeeze your sister's hand." The seconds stretched into a full minute with no response, and Michelle felt her momentary hope begin to fade. But Molly hadn't moved, her body still pressed against Ryan's side, that unusual vibration continuing to emanate from her chest. Then, so faintly that Michelle thought she might have imagined it, she felt the slightest pressure against her fingers, the ghost of a squeeze. He squeezed. She whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I felt it." Dr. Vasquez nodded, her expression cautiously optimistic. "His brain activity is definitely increasing. This doesn't mean he's waking up immediately. The process of emerging from a coma, especially a medically induced one, is gradual. But these are encouraging signs." They remained there for nearly an hour, Molly maintaining her position against Ryan, while Dr. Vasquez monitored his vital signs and occasionally tested for responses. Each time, the reactions grew marginally stronger. A finger twitch, a slight change in breathing when his name was spoken, a more definite squeeze of Michelle's hand. When it was finally time to leave, Michelle expected resistance from Molly, but the Bobcat seemed strangely satisfied. She allowed herself to be guided back into the travel kennel without protest, though her eyes remained fixed on Ryan until the very last moment. "What happens now?" Michelle asked as they prepared to leave. "Now we watch and wait," Dr. Vasquez replied. "Based on what we've seen tonight, I think we can begin to slowly reduce his sedation tomorrow, a bit earlier than we'd originally planned. The rest will be up to him." She smiled gently. "And perhaps up to Molly too." The next 3 days brought gradual but steady improvement. Ryan's brain activity continued to increase, and as the medical team carefully reduced his sedation, he began to show more consistent responses to stimuli, turning toward voices, responding to simple commands like squeeze my hand or wiggle your toes. On the fourth day after Molly's visit, Ryan opened his eyes for the first time. His gaze was unfocused at first, his consciousness clearly drifting, but when Michelle leaned over him and spoke his name, his eyes found hers and held, a moment of recognition that sent tears streaming down her face. "You're in the hospital," she explained gently, knowing he might not remember. "You had a brain hemorrhage, but you're getting better." Ryan's brow furrowed, confusion evident in his eyes. His mouth worked silently around the ventilator tube, clearly trying to communicate something. "Don't try to talk yet," Michelle soothed. "The doctors are hoping to remove the breathing tube soon if you continue improving like this." But Ryan's expression grew more distressed, his hand lifting weakly to tug at the tube. "He's fighting the ventilator," the attending nurse observed. "That's actually a good sign. Means his own breathing drive is strong." Dr. Vasquez was called, and after a thorough examination, made the decision to attempt extubation. "His oxygen levels are good, and his latest scans show significant improvement in the brain swelling," she explained. "If he can breathe on his own, removing the tube will make him more comfortable and allow him to communicate." The process was quick but uncomfortable for Ryan, leaving him coughing and disoriented. But once the tube was out and replaced with a simple oxygen cannula, the relief in his eyes was evident. He swallowed painfully several times before managing a raspy whisper. "Molly." Michelle's heart swelled. Of course his first word would be for the companion who might have saved his life twice now. First by alerting Michelle to his collapse, then by somehow reaching him in the depths of his coma. "She's at home, and she misses you terribly," Michelle assured him, squeezing his hand. "She actually came to visit you a few days ago." The doctors made a special exception. Ryan's eyes widened slightly, a ghost of a smile touching his cracked lips. "I felt her," he whispered. "Thought I was dreaming. Felt her weight, her breathing. Heard her." Dr. Vasquez exchanged a meaningful glance with Michelle. "You were deeply sedated at that point, Ryan. It's remarkable that you were aware of her presence." Ryan's eyelids drooped, exhaustion claiming him even after this brief interaction. "She called me back," he murmured, his words slurring as he drifted toward sleep. "Was floating away. She called me home." Recovery was neither swift nor easy. Ryan faced weeks of hospitalization followed by months of rehabilitation. The hemorrhage had left him with weakness on his left side and occasional difficulty finding words, challenges that frustrated the formerly active outdoorsman. But where medical science offered treatments for his physical recovery, it was Molly who seemed to provide the motivation he needed on the darkest days. Initially, after being discharged from the hospital to a rehabilitation facility, Ryan's separation from Molly continued to weigh heavily on them both. Michelle maintained her dual caregiving role, dividing her time between visiting her brother and tending to the increasingly restless Bobcat. "She knows you're coming home soon," Michelle told Ryan during one visit, showing him videos of Molly investigating the accommodations she'd made to help with his recovery: widened doorways, a ramp to the deck, grab bars in strategic locations. "I think she's supervising all the changes." Ryan's smile, though lopsided from lingering facial weakness, lit up his entire face. "Keeping you in line, is she?" His speech had improved dramatically, though he still searched for words occasionally. "She always did think she was in charge." The day Ryan finally came home, leaning heavily on a cane but proudly walking under his own power, was marked by a moment neither he nor Michelle would ever forget. As the car pulled up to the house, Molly appeared on the deck, her spotted body perfectly still except for the quivering tip of her tail. When Ryan emerged from the passenger seat, moving slowly but steadily, the Bobcat made a sound Michelle had never heard before, a series of chirps that rose in pitch and urgency, almost like a question. "Yes, it's me," Ryan called softly, his voice breaking with emotion. "I'm home, Molly girl. What happened next would have alarmed anyone who didn't understand their unique relationship. Molly launched herself from the deck in a fluid leap, covering the distance to Ryan in seconds. But instead of knocking him over as Michelle momentarily feared, the Bobcat circled him once, rubbing against his legs, before sitting directly in front of him, her golden eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that seemed to communicate volumes. Ryan carefully lowered himself to one knee, balancing with his cane, and extended his free hand. Molly pressed her head against his palm, then moved forward to touch her nose to his, a greeting that brought tears to his eyes. "Missed you too," he whispered. "Thank you for finding help." In the months that followed, as Ryan worked through the grueling process of regaining his strength and relearning certain skills, Molly never strayed far from his side. She adapted her behavior to his new limitations, no longer jumping onto furniture when he was nearby, seemingly aware of his precarious balance. During his daily physical therapy exercises, she would position herself where he could see her, her attentive presence a constant motivation. On the days when frustration overwhelmed him and progress seemed impossible, it was Molly who drew him out of despair, bringing her favorite toy mouse to drop at his feet, or simply pressing against his leg until he acknowledged her presence. "It's like she's my personal therapist," Ryan joked to Michelle during one of her regular visits. They sat on the deck, watching the sunset paint the Colorado mountains in shades of amber and rose, while Molly patrolled the yard below. "Except she has much better bedside manner than the actual therapists." Michelle smiled, noting how much stronger her brother looked than even a month ago. "You know, Dr. Vasquez has been following your case with particular interest. She said she's never seen anything quite like what happened when Molly visited you in the ICU." Ryan nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've been trying to explain it to my cognitive therapist, but it sounds crazy even to me. I was nowhere, floating in this dark, quiet place. No pain, no fear, just nothing." He paused, searching for the right words. "Then I felt this weight, this warmth, and vibration, not sound exactly, but something I could feel inside me. It was like being called by a voice that doesn't use words." He reached down to stroke Molly as she returned to the deck, settling at his feet with a contented chuff. "The doctors can call it coincidence or say it was just time for me to start responding. But I know what happened." He met Michelle's gaze steadily. "She found me when I was lost, and she led me home." Michelle didn't argue. She had seen too much over the past months to dismiss her brother's experience. From Molly's distress before anyone knew Ryan was in danger, to the remarkable changes in his vital signs during her hospital visit, to the inexplicable bond that seemed to have deepened through their shared trauma. "You know," she said instead, "I always thought you were a little crazy for keeping a wild animal as a companion. I worried about you, about whether it was fair to her." She smiled ruefully. "I've never been happier to be proven wrong." Ryan laughed, the sound still the greatest music to Michelle's ears after coming so close to losing him forever. "Don't tell her that. She already has a big enough ego." As if understanding his words, Molly raised her head and fixed him with a dignified stare before pointedly looking away. A gesture so human-like that both siblings burst into laughter. The sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and blue. In the gathering twilight, the lines between human and animal, between the explainable and the mysterious, seemed to blur. Whatever science might say about coincidence or animal instinct or the power of familiar presences to reach through the fog of coma, Ryan and Michelle knew a deeper truth, that sometimes the most profound connections transcend understanding, reaching across the boundaries between species and even, perhaps, between life and death. Ryan reached down to scratch Molly behind her tufted ears, his movements stronger and more fluid than they had been in many months. "What do you think, girl? Ready for a short walk before dinner?" Molly chirped her agreement, rising to pace expectantly toward the steps that led down from the deck. As Ryan followed, leaning less heavily on his cane than the week before, Michelle watched them go, man and Bobcat, survivor and savior, moving together into the gentle embrace of the coming night. In that moment, she understood with perfect clarity what Ryan had tried to explain about being called home. Love, in all its forms, was the most powerful force in the universe, a beacon that could guide lost souls back from the darkest places. And sometimes, that beacon came in the most unexpected forms, carried by hearts that beat to rhythms different from our own, but no less true, no less vital, no less miraculous.